Hello and welcome to yet another video discussing the play Lear by Edward Bond. In this video, we will look at the theme of violence in this play as well as in the plays of Bond in general. Now, for this purpose, we will depend mostly on the author's preface written by Edward Bond for the print version of his play Lear. In his preface, Bond begins his author's preface with this quote: I write about violence as naturally as Jane Austen writes about manners. Violence shapes and obsesses our society, and if we do not stop being violent, we have no future. People who do not want writers to write about violence want to stop them writing about us and our time. It would be immoral not to write about violence. So Bond seems to be saying that he does not write about violence in order to shock people. It is not a kind of gratuitous representation of violence, but rather violence is as much a sign of our times as manners were a sign of Jane Austen's times in the 19th century. So, because our society is violent, because it is shaped by violence, the only way to be true to that reality, the only way for art to be true to social reality is to reflect that violence, and not just reflect that violence, but to reflect on that violence, to critique that violence, to make us think about that violence. This is the moral imperative facing writers today, according to Edward Bond. Because today we live in a violent society, a society that is shaped by violence, that has violence at its core, and therefore writers have no option but to write about violence. And if you tell a writer not to write about violence, then that writer will have to stop writing about the contemporary time, because the contemporary time is violent. And he closes that quote by saying it would be immoral not to write about violence. So it is an imperative, it is a moral imperative to write about violence. There is violence in our society, and the writers have to, it is a morally, they have no option but to write about that violence and to critique that violence. Now, Bond begins his preface by distinguishing between the violence we see among animals and the violence we see among human beings. So, Bond says that animals are naturally violent, but they are not aggressive. Animals kill other animals because they are hungry, because they want to eat, and not to destroy that entire species. So, if a lion sees a deer, that lion might chase and kill that deer if the lion is hungry. Suppose the lion is already sated. Even if an entire horde of deer walks by, the lion may not do anything. So, animals are violent only when they want to eat, only when they are means a particular kind of violence which is intended on destruction, that you are violent for the purpose of being violent. So animals are not naturally aggressive, even though they are naturally violent, but human beings are aggressive. Human beings are the only animals that destroy or kill their own species. Normally, among animals, the predators will kill the prey. A lion will kill the deer, but lions don't normally kill their own species unless they are threatened, and or unless they are in the process of mating. So there are very few instances where animals will fight against and kill other animals of the same species. But human beings are the only animals that destroy their own species. And then he goes on to say this doesn't mean that aggression is a basic human need or a basic human instinct. No, that is not true. It is not a basic instinct or a need like the need for food or the need for sex. Rather, he says that aggression is socially conditioned. It is created by the way we live in society. Aggression stems from the feeling of danger, of a threat to our existence. It is when we feel threatened that we become aggressive. Normally, there is no need for us to be aggressive, but if we feel that our very existence is under threat, if we feel that we are under danger from someone or something outside us, then we become aggressive. And in this play, the wall that is built by Lear is an epitome of the fear of outside dangers leading to aggression. So this is something, this is an analysis that we can make. This is because if you think about a wall is a defensive formation. It is not an offensive formation. A wall is not an aggressive military strategy, rather it is a military strategy for defense. If you build a wall around your house or around your country, what you are basically saying is that I will protect my house or I will protect my country. So building a wall, when you build a wall, you are basically aware of threats from outside. That is the very meaning of a wall. So when Lear builds a wall in the first scene of the first act, he says that he is afraid of the neighboring countries which are ruled by the dukes of North and Cornwall. So he is afraid that his enemies will attack him at some point, and it is this fear of an outside danger that leads him to build this wall. And the fear of danger also makes Lear very aggressive. So when people pull down the wall, he executes them. Or if soldiers don't do as well as they are told to do, he executes them. And when his daughters say, let us forget all this aggression and let us live in peace with the dukes of North and Cornwall, let us get married to them and let us join the kingdoms and live in peace, Lear refuses this because he is afraid. And this fear leads him to be aggressive, not just against his enemies, but also against his own daughters and his own people. And thus, the wall becomes a symbol for the how fear leads to aggression. Now, aggression may not be a basic need, but Bond goes on to say that justice is a basic need. Every human being wants justice. And what is justice? According to him, it is the ability to live as nature intends you to live. So nature doesn't intend any of us to be afraid. Nature doesn't intend any of us to be humiliated. Nature doesn't intend any of us to starve, etc. So there is a way of coexisting peacefully in nature. And if you're able to, if everybody is able to do that, then we have justice in a society. And that kind of justice is a basic need for human beings. And when that justice is denied, then we have injustice. And in that situation, human beings are forced to struggle against injustice. So when there is injustice in society, human beings are forced to struggle against that injustice, and that struggle itself can often turn aggressively violent. For example, we can look at the character of Cordelia in this play. Cordelia, if you remember, was the in this particular play, Cordelia is not Lear's daughter, but rather she is a peasant woman. She was the wife of the gravedigger's boy, and she was raped by the soldiers of Bodis and Fontenelle when they were searching for Lear. And when they found Lear in the house of the gravedigger's boy, they killed the boy and they raped his wife Cordelia. This injustice that Cordelia suffered led her to fight against that injustice by forming a rebel army. But this leads her to be aggressive and violent in turn. And she herself, when she comes to power, she ends up becoming unjust, just like Bodis and Fontenelle before her, and just like Lear before them. Now, we already mentioned that it is injustice that leads to aggression, but Bond meditates on that in much greater detail in his preface. He says that human beings become aggressive when they are forced to live in ways that are unnatural. So there is a natural way in which we are supposed to live, not in a stratified society of lots of people being ruled by certain classes or certain kings or things like that. That is a very unnatural way of living, but a more peaceful and harmonious coexistence where everyone is equal, that would be closer to how society intends us to live. Animals live like that. They don't have such stratified structures of society. This is Edward Bond's explanation. Okay, so he says that in today's world, especially with the combination of capitalism and technology, human beings become alienated from nature, from their own true nature, not just from the nature that is out there, but also from their own true nature and from the ways in which, the natural ways in which they are supposed to live. So capitalism and technology combine to make us, for example, work in factories from morning to evening, and all this work is not for your own profit. The workers in factories work hard and long hours for somebody else's profit. This is a very unnatural way of living. This is not how nature intends us to live. If we were living in a natural way and if we were to work hard, then we ourselves would reap the benefits of that hard work. But that's not how we are living. So you can also see in Bond's professor suspicion of technology. He seems to say that technology is a very alienating thing. And he is also somebody who has worked closely with other playwrights of the time like Bertolt Brecht. And this idea of alienation as being very as being at the core of contemporary society. He is writing this in the 1970s. So in the 1960s and 70s, capitalism was at its peak, so to speak, and technology was advancing in leaps and bounds. So all these created a condition where human beings are alienated from their own natural selves. And this is also reminiscent of Karl Marx saying that capitalism is something that alienates the worker from his or her own labor. So this idea of alienation is very important. And according to Bond, it is precisely this alienation that produces anxiety and aggression in people. So when you are happy and peaceful, then you don't feel anxiety and then you don't become aggressive. It is when you are anxious that you become aggressive, and when you become anxious, when you are alienated. And when human beings live in large groups, the leaders create certain rules or norms of society, which he calls social morality. So, social morality, according to Bond, is not necessarily always a good thing. He is actually saying that social morality is a bad thing, which is the reason for all this alienation. So, when human beings decide to live in large groups, some people come as leaders, and these leaders will receive certain privileges which other people will not receive. So, the social morality is something that the leaders create in order to regulate society. And in some sense, we think some form of social morality is necessary because social morality refers to the code of laws, both written and unwritten, according to which human beings live. So, including actually written down laws like you cannot kill somebody or you cannot steal somebody else's property. That's also part of social morality. But more importantly, there are certain unwritten codes on how we should behave with each other. For example, respect your elders, love your parents, all these kind of things. So this all these written and unwritten codes of social morality are created by the leaders of society, and the social morality is then imposed on the rest of society. But interestingly, what happens is that when this morality is created, the leaders do it in such a way that the social morality is biased towards them. it is biased against the rest of society, but it is biased towards the leaders. That means it favors the leaders. So they make the rules because the leaders are the ones who make the rules. They make rules in such a way that they receive some privileges. And initially they have some justification for this, that we are the leaders and you cannot apply the same rule to us as you would apply to somebody else. So for example, I cannot kill somebody else, but my leaders, that is basically the state, right? The state with its army, its police, etc., is able to kill people. And the state has a justification for this. The state says if everybody goes and starts killing people, even if that person is somebody who has done some wrong against you, then society will collapse. The entire fabric of society will collapse. But rather, the state should have the privilege of deciding whom to kill. And therefore you will have a procedure, and you will have the criminals be taken to court, and at the end of that the judge will say this person should be hanged or this person should be beheaded or whatever. And the state is the only person who has the state is the only entity that has the privilege to kill somebody. So these kind of privileges were initially given to the leaders, whether it is a king, whether it is a democratically elected government, etc. The leaders have certain privileges, and initially those privileges had certain kind of justifications. But as time goes by, as society develops, as years go by and centuries go by, the privileges that these leaders receive are passed down to their children and the children's children, generation after generation, and this becomes an injustice. So that this leads to the creation of different classes in society, where there is a privileged class who are the descendants of those early leaders, and every time, because the rules are slanted towards them, because the rules favor them, the leaders are always chosen from that class. Whether it is the whites, for example, in Western countries, or the upper caste people in ancient Indian Hindu society, etc., etc. In every society, there will be some section of people who would be the leaders, and then for generations and generations they will ensure that social morality is favorable to them, and social morality decides that their own descendants will become leaders after them. And this leads to great structural injustice in society. Thus, social morality is something that always reinforces the status quo. Status quo means the status of society as it is now. So, however society is now, to reinforce it, to make sure that it doesn't change, it doesn't transform, it doesn't get revolutionized. That is how social morality works. And it is not that social morality is only something that is imposed from above by the leaders. Bond says that even those who are supposedly the victims of social morality believe in it and follow it, because they think that the society cannot function without the social morality. So suppose we are to question that social morality, we think that the entire fabric of society will fall apart. So an example that he gives from his time is all the ordinary people who allowed Hitler to come to power in Nazi Germany by thinking that Hitler made the trains run on time. So there are a lot of people who justify, for example, the emergency that was imposed in India by Indira Gandhi in the 1970s. A lot of people said that, yes, Indira Gandhi imposed the emergency and curtailed the rights and freedoms of a lot of people, but things worked properly. People went to offices on time. Otherwise, government offices were places where people did not go on time, or they did not do their work. But during the emergency, all these things were done. So these are the ways in which ordinary people like you and me have justified social morality, even coming from an authoritarian or a dictatorial position. We tend to think that social morality, since it is social morality that regulates society, there is no way that we can oppose that social morality. But Bond seems to be saying with this play, Lear especially, that it is only when we question that social morality and try to work against the injustice of it that society can move forward. Now, we have already seen that Bond believes that aggression is not natural behavior but rather learned behavior. And he goes on to talk about how children develop from innocence to aggression. So, here is another quote from his author's preface. Every child is born with certain biological expectations, or if you like, species assumptions, that its unpreparedness will be cared for, but emotional reassurance that its vulnerability will be shielded, that it will be born into a world waiting to receive it and that knows how to receive it. So, when a child is born, the child doesn't know how dangerous the world is, or the child doesn't know that the world is going to be hostile to it. So, when every child is born, there is a certain biological expectation that somebody will take care of that child. In all other species, when children are born, the rest of the members of the species take care of it. Even if it's not the father or mother of that child, of that particular young one, the other members of the species will somehow may take care of it for a short while. And however, human children realize very quickly that the expectation they have of the world and the way in which the world reacts to it will be very different. Unlike other animals, human children are very, very unprepared to be born into this world. It takes several years for human children to be prepared, to be equipped to deal with the world. They cannot find food for themselves, they cannot walk, or they cannot do anything when they are born, and for several years after that. So the child will have a certain expectation that somebody will provide not just food but also emotional reassurance, emotional sustenance. The child is vulnerable, so the child hopes that somebody else will shield the vulnerability of that child, somebody else will protect the child from dangers. And the child also hopes that the world is waiting to receive it. The world is expecting this child, and the world will be happy to receive this child, and the world knows how to receive it. That means the world knows what are the things that should be done to make that child comfortable in the world. But all these assumptions are proven false by the reaction given to the child in its very early years. And here, Bond is talking about a variety of sets of violent practices that we use against children, from the physical violence that is perpetrated on children, not just in terms of child abuse that we hear a lot of stories about, but even on a very everyday level. We think that we as adults have a right to discipline the child using physical punishment, corporeal punishment. Until very recently in schools, even now in some schools, if the child is disobedient, or if there is some need to discipline the child, it will be done with a cane or with some such physical corporeal punishment. Parents and elder siblings and other elder members of the family think that they have a right to discipline the child by hitting, pinching, etc. So these are all ordinary, everyday physical violence that is perpetrated on the child. But apart from this physical violence, there is also a lot of emotional violence that is perpetrated on the child. The child is made to feel unwanted, the child is made to feel vulnerable, the child is made to feel insecure, etc. etc. So all these result in different types of violence against the child, and all this violent behavior is completely against the expectation of the child, which would be that it would be taken care of. And then now what happens to this child? So when the child is born, it is innocent, but soon the child learns that it is born into a hostile world, a dangerous world, and the child begins to panic. In its fear and panic, it identifies with the people who have power over it. It accepts the social morality that is imposed by the people in power out of fear and panic. So, this is most obvious in the case of a family where the child realizes that if the child is not to be beaten up, if the child is not to face emotional and physical violence and deprivation, then it has to make the parents happy. Parents or whoever is in power. When the child goes to school, the child learns that the child has to conform to the rules that are presented by the teachers. And when the child grows up and goes out into the world, it realizes that it has to follow the rules set by the people who are powerful in society. So, out of fear and panic, children begin to socialize in such a way that they imbibe the dominant social morality that is imposed by the people in power. So the children try to identify with the people in power and learn and accept their form of social morality. Thus, according to Bond, social morality can be considered a corrupted form of innocence, and thus it becomes a threat or a weapon to be used against the interests of justice. So earlier we had said that justice is when everybody is free to live without fear or without humiliation as nature intended. Injustice is when this is impossible, and that injustice is perpetrated in society by social morality, because social morality not just regulates a society, it is also favorable to those who are the leaders of society, those who are in powerful positions. And when children realize that social morality is against them, instead of rebelling against that, most of them, what happens is that they accept that social morality, because they realize that if they violate that social morality, they will be punished. So they accept and conform to social morality, and they also become cogs in the wheel of injustice. Such children grow up to be ugly, deceitful, and violent, and the socially conforming good citizens will be the most violent of them all. So, the deceit and violence and ugliness that Bond is talking about is not a physical ugliness or physical violence that these people do, but there is a kind of corrupt internal violence that grows inside these people. So, the people who are most socially conforming, those who are considered to be good citizens, those who follow all the rules of society, they will be the ones who are most violent inside their minds. So it is not the gang leaders or the terrorists or those people, they are not the only violent people. Maybe the people who are just like you and me, who live as part of society, who form the very living fabric of society, who are the government workers, the teachers, the post office people, the ordinary people, our family, our friends, we ourselves, we who obey social morality, who follow social morality, even though it is unjust, because we are afraid to rebel against it, we will be the most violent of everyone. And an example for this from the play is how Lear realizes that his daughters were innocent in their childhood, but they grow up to become aggressive, deceitful, and violent because he had imposed a certain kind of social morality on them. So it is not exactly his fault, it is not the fault of Bodice and Fontenelle either, it is the very society, it is the social conditioning through which they passed, where they realized that unless they counter Lear, their parent, with violence, they will be vulnerable. So because they were afraid that the father would punish them, they had to take some measures to remove the threat of the father. The father, Lear, became a threat to them. They panicked, they were fearful, and all their innocence was corrupted by this panic and fear. And initially, they identified with Lear's social morality, But after a while, they rebelled against it and they in turn became violent and aggressive. Thus, it is not human beings who are aggressive by nature, it is society that is aggressive by nature. The kind of society we live in is an unjust society, and an unjust society has no option but to be violent. Every unjust society will lead to violence because it is a very inherent human tendency to fight against injustice. So when there is injustice, you will be worried, you will be tensed, anxious, you will panic, you will feel fear, and then you have no other way to react against this fear but to become aggressive yourself. Thus, to sum up the major points in this video lesson, first of all, Lear's Bond says that society is basically unjust, and this injustice in society makes people live unnatural lives. And as we already mentioned, this is due to a combination of capitalism and technology in our times, but at different points in history there have been different reasons why society has been unjust and how the people who live in society are forced to live unnatural lives. These two situations, these two aspects of society, its injustice and its unnatural nature, create a natural biological aggressive response in the members of society. Society tries to counter this aggression by imposing social morality. But social morality is just another form of violence which itself provokes more aggression in its subjects. The only answer to injustice, according to Bond, is the relentless pursuit of justice. So the only thing you can do is relentlessly pursue justice. And the best example of this is the ending of the play when Lear dies while trying to pull down the wall that he himself built. And if the wall was a symbol of injustice, then his attempt, even a failed attempt to pull down the wall, becomes a symbol for the ordinary people. He becomes a symbol inspiring the ordinary people fighting for justice. So Thomas and Susan at the end of the play, in the third act, the ordinary peasant people, Thomas and Susan, are examples of a new desire in society. When ordinary people try to counter injustice, not like Cordelia, because Cordelia ended up becoming unjust herself. She became aggressive and she became another epitome of injustice. But rather Thomas and Susan don't go down the same route. What they do is they try to form a new society, a new community where people can come to their home and be comforted and form a kind of equal society. So this is all in its infancy. There is just a hint that all these things can happen. But when Lear goes to die, it is in the hope that he will become a symbol for all these ordinary people, these common people, and that someday they will be able to come up with a revolution, a real revolution, not a false revolution like Cordelia's revolution, but a real revolution which does not use aggression. A revolution against injustice, a revolution for justice, for reinstating justice in society, but without being aggressive. This is the hopeful message that Edward Bond presents to us at the end of his play Lear. So I hope this video was clear to you. Thank you for watching.